Well, okay.
The dates, please.
Even though he started, I'll say yes. Sorry, date. I will write the date. One more thing though about...
And be aligned between those two lines.
Yeah. Isn't that what I always do?
Yeah, that's okay, but still, if any confusion, that's a...
Okay, fine. Yeah, those.
Okay, thank you.
The last point I wanted to make about the homeworks is that obviously they are largely joint efforts among all of you or many of you, but I have no problem with that. But there is one concern I have. Maybe I can sketch it for you. So here is the potential. Here is the true vacuum. Here is the false vacuum. This represents for me the correct answer. This represents a wrong answer, and this represents all of you. And if enough of you collaborate, you can all end up with the wrong answer. Okay? So that is not what collaboration should do. Collaboration should drive all of you here. It shouldn't drive all of you there. If I find many people getting the wrong answer and the same wrong answer for the same reasons, then I really worry. So please revise your collaboration methods, whatever they are. Okay, collaboration in itself is not an issue. This is an advanced topical course, and you are going to be scientists and you are going to collaborate. Nothing wrong with collaborating. But please don't let your collaboration, few times that has happened, so please be careful about that. And anyway, I repeat, I welcome anybody to drop in as long as I'm free and talk to me about their homework assignments. Because really I would like everybody to get get an A grade in this course. There's no reason why not. Okay. I have the other two come in so far, Nilay and Rupal. Here, which one are you? Good. And so before I start today, I also have one little business to clear up last time. So thank you all for your comments about that binding energy issue. It's actually terribly simple. What I did last time was exactly right. I just forgot to make one observation which would make it clear. So let me just remind you that we wrote a metric last time which had a function beta in it, and so that metric took the form. So last time the metric took the form okay. And then this was last time, means this was in the presence of an energy momentum tensor for perfect fluid defined by its pressure and density. So this was the metric, and then after some work we concluded that e to the 2 beta turns out to be 1 over 1 minus 2gm of r upon r, and then various things follow from there. And finally we found that the mass of the object as defined, it's not the mass of the object but the sum of the masses of the constituents was coming out to be this. Well, I guess here the integration limit would be r tilde, so it could also be infinity because after r tilde there is no density. And this divided by this factor, while m, the true mass, so this is true mass, and this I just call sum of constituent masses. So the analogy with hydrogen atoms should be very clear. This is like the sum of the mass of a proton and the mass of an electron. This is the mass of the hydrogen atom, which you know is slightly less than the mass of the proton plus the mass of the electron, and that's why the atom is stable, right? This one is this. This is all we said last time. The puzzle was to prove that this one is greater than this one, okay? Because only then it makes sense to say the difference between the two is binding energy, okay? So how do we know? m tilde is greater than m. And that hinges on something which is much more basic and which I completely forgot to say, which is how do we know this object is or is not a black hole? Okay, I solved some equations in the presence of an energy momentum tensor T mu nu, which is specified by P and rho. And P and rho can take any value consistent with these equations. In particular, they can both be 0. But if they are both 0, then we know what happens. We know that this m of r becomes capital M, and we know that the thing is a black hole, right? Because that's the vacuum solution. So I solved a more general system, but I forgot to tell you at the end, how do we decide that this thing is or is not a black hole? Okay, we expect that for some types of matter distribution which reach outside the horizon and are sufficiently well behaved, then the solution will continue inside to the origin smoothly without ever turning into a black hole. But we didn't test that. Okay, there must be some types where it remains a black hole. After all, just imagine a matter distribution where 99.999% of the matter is at the origin and a tiny shell outside GM, 2GM is located outside 2GM. That's not likely to stop the thing becoming a black hole. Right? So, in short, we don't know until we complete the solution of the Tolman, Oppenheimer, Volkov equation and the equation of state, we don't know what object we have. But if it's not a black hole, if it's a proper solution, if it's a regular star, then one thing we certainly expect is that this term should not change sign any time between outside and the origin, because this is the space direction. In a black hole, this changes sign at the horizon. But supposing by putting matter, this thing is no longer a black hole, then this term shouldn't change sign. So if it is a regular star, then e to the beta should certainly be positive. Okay, and e to the beta is this denominator factor. This should be positive. So for any r, even if r comes very near 0, this thing doesn't overwhelm the first term. Okay, so therefore this thing is always between 0 and 1. And then we are done because the denominator is always between 0 and 1. So this one, pointwise in the integral, is bigger than this one. Okay? So if e to the beta is greater than 0, it implies that 1 over root 1 minus. First of all, that implies that this is well defined, otherwise this isn't even well defined. Right? Where the thing under the square root could change sign if e to the beta changes sign. So this doesn't even make sense if e to the beta is allowed to change sign. So before we talked about this, we should have first convinced ourselves that, well, we are only going to discuss those cases where this is a regular star, it's not a black hole. In those cases, this is positive, and of course, once it's positive, it's manifestly between 0 and 1, because r equals infinity is 0, okay, and it can never cross 1, because otherwise that would make e to the 2 beta negative. So it implies that this lies between this, and so we are done. If on the other hand this condition is not satisfied, then there is no point calling this a binding end, the difference of these two a binding energy, because this thing is not a normal star, then we don't know what it is. Could be some singular solution, yes.
Why can't it change sign twice? Like for some small, like from R1 to R2 inside the star, it can be negative and then again.
That's still a black hole. Reissner-Nordstrom is like that. It changes sign twice. Actually, I'll briefly mention.
No, but in that case, wouldn't it be the case that we can go out from the inside?
It may be, but it's still a black hole. Reissner-Nordstrom is the case, so you can go out from the inside, but it's still a black hole. Okay? It's certainly not a normal star. By a normal star, for our purposes here, you can give long definitions, but for our purposes, a normal star basically is that you have Schwarzschild solution as long as you're in vacuum, and after that, that solution just smoothly goes to the origin without any change in the causal structure or space-time. Light cones never tilt. There are no horizons. Okay? What you're suggesting could be multiple horizons. That's very possible, but that's not a normal star. That's in fact a solution with a curvature singularity. The entire goal of the exercise to solve this in the presence of a perfect fluid was to hope that the perfect fluid will remove the singularity at the origin. Okay? So if that singularity is removed, and if the light cones don't flip and R never becomes time-like, then this whole discussion makes sense. Otherwise, you shouldn't be asking this question. Just to clarify a small point. Well, if it's positive, it means that 1 minus 2 gm upon r is positive, right? Okay. So, sorry, what did I? No, I don't mean 1. I don't mean 1. That's all I mean. 1 minute. Sorry. I'm again confused. I keep flipping and flopping about this. This thing is less than. Yeah, it is less than 1, isn't it? Yeah, right. Not this thing, sorry. The thing upstairs. This thing. This thing is between zeros. So that's therefore this. So in other words, the denominator, the thing downstairs, is greater than 1. Which is what we want. Thanks. Good. Okay. So if that's all clear, today we'll do something quite entertaining, which I find it very entertaining. Also because it gave me a chance to remind myself about this subject, which has long been considered very, very difficult and obscure. And this is the issue of Penrose diagrams. Sometimes in the book these are called Carter-Penrose diagrams, and sometimes conformal diagrams, the same thing. One thing that I am struck by is that most textbooks, certainly older textbooks, either don't discuss them at all, such as Weinberg type of books, or if they discuss them, then it's a book like Hawking and Ellis, which is very, really like a piece of applied mathematics, very hard book, or Wall. Even Wall doesn't seem to discuss it much, if at all. Or, they just introduce them very, very sketchily and as if it's something very, very specialized. But in fact, especially from what I know of my colleagues' work in this department and so on, it's really not possible to understand properly either black holes or cosmology without a proper understanding of the causal structure of the space-time. Causal structure of the space-time is how the light cones are pointing, how a particle can propagate into the future or past. Okay, you always have light cones locally at any point in space-time. They can tilt. We've seen that in the Schwarzschild case. And wherever they are, along the axis of the light cone, massless particles, namely light, propagates because that's a null direction. And inside the light cone, all massive particles propagate. Okay, so how a particle is able to propagate, what the particle is able to achieve or not achieve, what it can in principle see or not see, entirely depends on the causal structure of space-time. And Penrose diagram is by far the most useful technique to understand, so that's what it is. It's a technique, it's really a choice of coordinates to understand the causal structure of space-time, of a given space-time. Now, one thing I won't be able to tell you is whether there is a definition for every possible space-time of the Penrose diagram. I'm not going to try and address something very, very general. What I'm going to try and do here is to illustrate Penrose diagram for two cases. One is Minkowski space, which is already a trivial space-time, and the other is the Schwarzschild one. The purpose being then to compare these two and see that how they differ is reflected in how their Penrose diagrams differ. Okay. The same thing can be done certainly for all black holes, for Reissner, Nordstrom, Kerr, etc. But it can also be done for cosmologies, which is more interesting because then the fact that we are in a universe with a positive cosmological constant has some implications for causality, which can be best seen using these diagrams. So it's a very useful tool. And the key, of course, is a choice of coordinates. And it's a very easy choice of coordinates actually. So I'm not really understanding why the subject was always presented as so complex and hard to understand. So we'll do it, and I think we'll make it very easy. Okay. Okay. Yeah, let me just anticipate two results. Key is the choice of coordinates and results. One. Of course, this is slightly misleading because it's not the only point. Light cones are always at 45 degrees. That means we choose coordinates such that the light cones in the space-time never tilt around. Okay, so Schwarzschild coordinates are not coordinates like that. Those are coordinates where the light cones open and then as you come close to the horizon they close up or they tilt over. If you are in Kruskal coordinates also that happens. So here the light cones are always preserved at 45 degrees. So you see diagrams in which there are lots of lines at 45 degrees. So you better get used to drawing lines at 45 degrees. That's one thing. But it's by no means the only thing. The other thing is all of space-time, including infinity, there can be many kinds of infinity as we will see, is brought to a finite region. So the change of coordinates resulting in Penrose coordinates, for lack of a better name, is such that the entire space-time you are interested in, including all the stuff that normally lies off the page of your notebook, is all brought into a finite region, including the end, the far future, infinite past, any other thing. It's all there in a finite place. So you can examine it very precisely and tell in which direction rays are going to go. In fact, just from these two facts, anticipating these, you should be very pleased. Because you can say, well, on a Penrose diagram, I can trace a ray of light with no trouble. Because give me a ray of light, well, it's going to propagate at 45 degrees because it propagates along the light cone. And it's going to reach the end of the diagram because I'm promising you that the diagram fits on your page, right? So it's going to reach the end. Okay, so there's not going to be any mystery about propagation of light. That's already a great thing. Actually, any other thing also will be similarly quite simple. So here's the transformation from Minkowski spacetime. Arguably, there aren't any really big questions that we want to answer about Minkowski spacetime and light propagation in it. Moreover, you could point out that the light cones are already at 45 degrees in the usual coordinates, so why are we doing all this? Indeed, we are doing it to learn about this. We are doing it as a toy example so that we can do it for more complicated examples. So here it will actually complicate the space-time, but in other cases it will simplify it. Okay. One more point perhaps which is not commonly made in the books. You see, when you have four coordinates x, y, z and t, it's very natural to consider a like or null combination, for example, x minus t and x plus t. Okay, but that leaves out y and z. Okay, or I can consider y minus t and y plus t, then it leaves out x and z. These are not adapted for anything with spherical symmetry. Choosing x, y and z, any of them out of rather than the other two, will not work nicely for systems with spherical symmetry. So in fact, the idea is always work as if there is spherical symmetry, because we'll be working with such examples right now, and use only the radius and time to make null directions, not the angles. Don't bring the angles into the story. It will lead to some puzzling things, but we'll clarify all the puzzles. So first I start with Minkowski space in this form, the very familiar form. And now, as I've been doing all along, I'll just forget about the last term. Okay. So obviously, if I just define u equals t minus r and v equals t plus r, then this makes it ds squared is equal to minus du dv. Good. And if I want to complete it with the other term, then it's u minus v squared upon 4 d omega squared. D omega 2 squared is d theta squared plus sin squared theta d phi squared, whatever it usually is. So we've not done very much, but now we notice that radial geodesics travel along u equals constant or v equals constant, radial null geodesics. We always be interested in null geodesics first. That's obvious because the geodesic equation you can read off from here is u dot v dot equals 0. It's actually not, it's the null equation, but it implies the geodesic equation. Is u dot v dot equals 0, so if either of them is constant, then we are on a null geodesic. Okay. As long as theta dot and phi dot are constant, which means I am moving purely in the radial direction. Now this leads to a slight puzzle, which is that in Minkowski space, of course, the radial direction is just my choice. I mean, the origin is just my choice. Okay, so there's nothing special about the radial direction, but this choice of coordinates singles out an origin. Now, if I do the same problem in Schwarzschild case, there is actually something special about the origin because that's where the black hole or the solution is centered. You have to be careful about that. Good. So we are not really done. This is a very these were Penrose coordinates you would have learned them in junior school. We have to do much more. However, we should still note one thing which is actually non-trivial. Since we have not combined a normal space coordinate x with t, but a radial coordinate r with t, remember that r is greater than or equal to 0. It only lives on the half line. That induces a constraint between u and v, and it says what? That u is less than or equal to v, and u becomes equal to v if r is 0. Okay, these things are very important. Every time we change coordinates, we need to check where are the values of the new coordinates. Good. Okay, now comes the big idea. So of course u is less than or equal to v, but other than that constraint, u is minus infinity and v also, both range from minus to plus infinity. So most of space-time doesn't actually fit on your page. It goes from minus to plus infinity. And the key function that brings it back, which is monotonic and takes an infinite interval to a finite interval, is tan inverse. What tan inverse does, it takes minus infinity to plus infinity and brings it to minus pi by 2 to plus pi by 2 in a monotonic way. So anything that was increasing will be still increasing. So let's define capital U is tan inverse of small u and capital V is tan inverse of small v. That's pretty much it. Okay. Now we can write the metric. That's a very trivial exercise, and it becomes 1 over cos squared u cos squared v minus d u d v plus sin squared v minus 2 over 4. So these formulae you should please check. It's completely trivial. You just invert these. U is tan of capital U, small v is tan of capital V. Plug it in there and just do it. For example, here you will find tan U minus tan V the whole square. Hopefully some identity will help you to get it in the form sin squared of this over cos squared 2 cos squared v. Like that. Okay. Good. Now let's ask what are the ranges of capital U and V. Well, first of all, because it's monotonic, this condition small u less than small v translates into capital U less than capital V. This is the meaning of monotonic. Beyond that, both of them lie between minus pi by 2 and pi by 2. And pi by 2 is sort of these minus and plus pi by 2 are the ends of the range that these coordinates take. So what we've basically done is bring in from infinity these very distant places and brought them very close by. Okay, good. So that's done. The last step is to take these new u and v and define a new coordinate, time and radial coordinate, capital T and R, like this. In fact, if you think about it, this is not that different from the kind of things we did with Kruskal coordinates, except that there we took exponential functions somewhere on the way, and here we are taking actually tan, not tan hyperbolic. Okay, it's actual tan. That's very important difference. In fact, when we apply this to the Schwarzschild case, we'll first take the Kruskal coordinates and then we'll take tan inverse of them. If you want the punchline, that's already the answer. Okay, we'll just take tan inverse of the Kruskal coordinates and we'll have the Penrose diagram. But now it's time to draw a picture, and here what I want to stress is that unlike many other types of coordinates we've used, here the goal of defining the new coordinates is not to write the metric and stare at it, but to draw a picture. It's more, this is a case where one picture is really worth 1,000 equations. So whenever we use Penrose type coordinates, we draw the diagram, and from the diagram we get what we want to know. And what we want to know, for example, will not be what is the equation of a geodesic, which in this coordinate system is a nightmare, and the geodesics are just constant in the old coordinates. So why are we in these coordinates? That's not what we want to know. We want to know what would a geodesic look like, where will it start and where will it end. That we can do very nicely in the Penrose diagram, and almost as easy even for Schwarzschild and more complicated spaces. Okay, so here's the diagram. And of course, one more thing we notice here is that from this restriction that u is less than or equal to v, it follows that the new r is also greater than or equal to 0. That's also like a radial coordinate. So now time to draw it. So the drawing is always done on the R, capital T plane. We ignore the angular stuff, but once in a while we bring it back or we remember it. It's always done in this, and once in a while we also remember. So in this case, there is nothing to remember about the original metric, which was just Minkowski. But when we do Schwarzschild, we'll also have to remember the original radial coordinate and what it means. So we'll have to point out on this diagram where is the horizon, where is the singularity. Good. So now time to draw some points which are all the same distance from the origin. Great activity. Okay, and join them up. Good. So what is this point? This is pi by 2 minus pi by 2. Same here. This line is v equals pi by 2. This line is v equals minus pi by 2. Likewise, this line is u equals pi by 2, and this line is u equals minus pi by 2. Alright? It's easy to identify the line by looking at its endpoints. For example, if u is minus pi by 2, then it means when r is 0, t is minus pi by 2, that's here, and when t is 0, r is pi by 2, and that's there. So it's the line joining those two points. That's clear.
U equal to pi by 2, the metric and ds squared at pi by 2.
Yeah.
That seems to diverge.
Yeah, it does.
That's like r equal to infinity.
Yes. That's correct. In fact, what happens is that the price we pay it's sort of obvious that it had to happen. This is infinity of some. These lines all correspond to some form of infinity. So it should be an infinite distance from here to reach that line. Looks finite on your board. The way that can be is that the metric we are working in now is such that the distances get longer and longer as you go closer and closer there. Okay, the metric distances are longer for finite coordinate distances. So there you have it. And the last thing to notice is that this side of the page is completely abolished because r is greater than or equal to 0. So it's only that right. So that's the Penrose diagram of Minkowski spacetime. So now let's try to understand. First, let's try to label it. This is really the part I enjoy
U
most.
minus pi by
1 second.
U equal to minus pi.
U equal to minus pi by 2. This line?
Because if R is by 2, then U must be minus by 2.
If r is pi by 2 and t is 0. Just convince myself it was the other way, but I think this is actually right because I think the u axis points that way. So this is u equals minus pi by 2. That was u equals pi by 2. In fact, the u axis points that way and the v axis points that way. So u increases that. That turns out. Thank you very much. Okay. So now it would be good enough to call these lines v equals pi by 2 and u equals minus pi by 2, but no. Relativists are a little different kind of people and they call this with this symbol and this one with this symbol, and this they refer to as scry plus and this they refer to as scry minus. Why? I don't know. Makes them feel good, I suppose. Scry, I don't even know whether there's any language in which there's something called scry. Anyway, take it from me, it makes you sound very good if you go around saying these things. Right? So scry plus and scry minus. In addition, it turns out, and we'll explain in a few seconds why they are important, that there are 3 more important points. They are endpoints of these lines, but they deserve their own names, and they are called I minus, I plus, and I 0. So the hallmarks of a Penrose diagram are lines called scry minus or scry plus, and points called I minus and I plus, as well as a point called I 0. Okay.
Sky is big I. That's why.
I suppose that must be it. Yeah. That's the reason? Okay. But I mean, okay, it's good. I very good. Okay. There will be a script J in that case. Okay. Very good. Now, why are they so named and what are their properties? Well, so here one of the key properties of, so first of all, let me say Minkowski spacetime is everything inside. Okay? In the sense that a spacetime or a space doesn't include the points at infinity. So in that sense, the real spacetime is everything strictly inside all of these lines. However, if you add in the lines, mathematicians call this a compactification of the space. What you do is you take the space as far as you can go and add those points by hand into the space so that now it has an end. Okay? It's a process very similar to taking what we call an open interval on the line. Okay? This is an open interval. We simply close it and make it a closed interval. What's the difference between these two? In one case the endpoints are not there, in the other case the endpoints are there. The open interval can be mapped smoothly in a topological sense onto the full line. Okay, so it's the open interval which naturally agrees with the full line just by a simple mapping, which in fact is tan inverse if you want a simple example. But after you have brought it to a finite point, you are free to close it. But that in that process you are said to have compactified it. Okay, now it's compact, includes its limit points, and so this is a compactification of Minkowski space. It shouldn't be too confusing because it's up to you to think whether this is part of the space-time or this is the infinite, it's an infinite limit of space-time. It's the end of space-time. Okay, so now, as promised, null geodesics are u equals constant or v equals constant. So they can only propagate that way or that way. Okay. Now, supposing they are propagating this way, then it's obvious that eventually they will hit Scri plus. Okay, so Scri plus is the final destiny of all null geodesics of this kind. On the other hand, if I have a null geodesic of this kind, then Scri minus is where it came from in the past. Okay. Now it may look in this diagram that something strange has to happen, because let's say this null geodesic starts from Scri minus and comes here. What does it do when it reaches here? Stays there, no?
It goes like this.
Yeah, there isn't anything there. That's the origin of Minkowski spacetime. Okay? So it actually what it does is to go this way and then go this way. And how is that possible? It's very confusing in this diagram. It's possible because we forgot the two sphere. Okay? If you bring back even one of the side circles of that two sphere, then you have to take this and rotate it to make basically a cone and another cone joined together. Okay? Now it's perfectly possible to start on Scri minus and go zooming through the origin, and you'll end up on Scri plus. Okay? The problem is that when you're going through the origin in polar coordinates, R suddenly the direction reverses itself. That's the fact. Okay? It's the same problem as saying that I have a particle moving on a plane in polar coordinates, and the particle just happens to go this way. Well, its R equation says R is decreasing, 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 and then suddenly increasing again, because nothing is happening to the particle in that process. It's because it's not that it's going back this way. Okay? So it's just the fact that this is a space with some more dimensions that we have been ignoring. So actually this is a trivial thing. So therefore, in fact, what we learn is that this distinction is illusory, and there is really only one kind of null geodesic. All null geodesics start from Scri minus and end at Scri plus. Good. So that allows us to give them names. So Scri minus is called past null infinity. Note that Scri minus itself being slanted at 45 degrees is a null surface. It's not just a line, it's actually the entire bottom of the cone that I get by taking this and copying it over a whole two sphere, which is very hard to imagine. But you can imagine replacing that two sphere by a circle, then it's like a surface of revolution, obviously. This also, all this makes it clear why we are only on this side. We are really looking at the radial part of a problem. And it's also therefore true that here what I am discussing are only radial geodesics. But in Minkowski spacetime, of course, there are all kinds of geodesics. Nothing forces a geodesic to be radial as such. But if it's not radial, then all the angle terms, the terms with d omega squared, which we neglected, will be activated. Then nothing is simple in those in that case. Okay. So these coordinates are adapted to studying what radial geodesics do. Again, in Minkowski spacetime, they are not even necessary, but in Schwarzschild spacetime, radial geodesics are very important, because those are the ones which will either fall in or come out, and then we can study. Okay. So of course, Scri plus likewise gets the name future null infinity. So the next question is, what does a time-like geodesic do? After all, any particle with a mass will follow a time-like geodesic, and the time-like geodesic has the rule that it can't go at 45 degrees, otherwise it would be null, but it has to go in a direction more time-like than that, so it has to go upwards, okay, which is just as well, because there isn't really much room. If it were going this way, it would be very strange, because this is the end of space-time, and this is past null infinity. So the fact that it's going sort of net upwards is the statement that it's time-like. Okay. But where will it start and where will it end? That's the question. So now you get a slightly surprising answer, which is that every time-like geodesic is of this form. It may bend differently in the interior of Minkowski spacetime, but it always starts at I minus and ends at I plus. So all time-like. Okay. If you're already convinced about that fact, we can go on, but I'm suspecting you're not convinced. So let's try to show you. First, let's give them names. Supposing this was true, then it would be natural to give I plus the name future time-like infinity, and I minus would be past infinity. Okay? And before we come, so I'm going to show that this is true, but before we complete that, before we prove it, we might as well complete the story by saying what I naught does. So, what do you think I naught does? Space-like geodesics. When do particles follow space-like geodesics? Imaginary mass. Basically never. Okay, but whatever, you can still think of space-like geodesics, and the claim is that space-like geodesics start and end on I0. Again, it's a bit bizarre because you'll imagine that they go here, curve around and come back, but that hardly looks like a geodesic. But what they really will do is go here and come back. This is again surface of evolution. Or you can think of them as going here and coming back. The same thing. And there is nothing future or past because they are space-like. So there are not two different I naughts, there is only one. So miraculously this diagram knows about that. It realizes that with time there is a past and a future, but with space there is only one infinity. And so this is called space-like infinity. Good. So we've said everything about this diagram that we need to say, except one, to demonstrate that time-like geodesics do what I said, and two, to point out that this is only the behavior of geodesics. There is nothing to prevent, for example, a massive particle being placed on a rocket ship and undergoing accelerated motion. And most things in life don't follow geodesics. Okay, if we followed a geodesic, we would simply freely fall to the center of the earth, but that's not what we practically do. And so those lines have some restrictions, namely they should propagate inside the line cone, but they can start anywhere and end anywhere. In particular, a time-like non-geodesic, so a particle, massive particle in non-geodesic motion, another name for non-geodesic is accelerated. Can start or end at square minus and square plus respectively. So a non-geodesic for a massive particle can very well start here and wiggle around and do anything it likes and end there. It's not ruled out. Just the geodesic will have this regulation that it starts here and ends here. And the null geodesics are straight lines starting here and ending. So what is special is that. Okay? Good. So here's a little exercise. So we want to look at time-like geodesics. So let's go back to the original coordinates. So in u, small v coordinates, which were made up by linear transformation of the original R and T of Minkowski spacetime. What is the equation for a time-like geodesic? Yeah, but we know all that, right? G00, there's no G00 now, there's a GUV and it's -1. So come on, you shouldn't have to look into your books for this. Okay, the metric is ds squared equals -du dv plus stuff that we are not interested in. So what's the geodesic now? We have to read it directly from the metric. No, it's a time-like geodesic. I want the time-like condition. Forget the geodesic equation. What is the condition for a time-like trajectory? U equals ds square less than 0 now. What equation does the velocity satisfy for a particle? The velocity for a particle for a massive particle, what is the equation? Very good. Okay, so now tell me that equation in these coordinates. Just asking you to change conventions. Okay, let's do it. U equals -1 G u. Now, mu and mu take the values small u and small v. So G, u, I'm sorry, there are too many u's in this problem. Plus G, Now, which of these contributes? What is GUU? 0. What is GVV? 0. What is GUV? What is U? Just the coordinate U dot. UV is the coordinate V dot. And we learn that U dot. Sorry. Now small problem. There is no 2. Because GUV is actually a half. So we learned that the equation is u dot v dot equals 1. But why we took so long about it? When you see a metric like this, you just find the geodesic equation, you just find the null equation by just dividing this by d tau and setting it to 0, and the time-like equation by setting it to -1. There's nothing more to do. All this stuff is formalism, right? But now we have an explicit example. I would have expected everybody just to say u dot v dot is 1. That's all it is. It's not the geodesic equation, it's the time-like condition. Okay, but that's good enough. At least that's good enough to start with. So notice first of all that it's not u equals constant or v equals constant. That would be so if the right side was 0. That would be the null condition. But it's not null. Now it's time-like. But it's this. Fine. So we are getting somewhere. Now the geodesic equation independently is that u double dot equals v double dot equals 0, because all connections are 0, right, in this metric, in these coordinates. So that means that these are linear, so actually we can just take u equals a tau plus b and v equals 1 by a tau plus c. In that case, u dot v dot also is equal to 1. Clear? Good. Now we need to painfully transform this into the Penrose coordinates, but it's actually very simple. This equation can be written as u minus b, v minus c equals tau squared. Okay? Now small u and small v I can write in terms of the Penrose diagram coordinates. Tan u minus b, tan v minus c is tau squared. This is my time-like geodesic. Moreover, tan u minus b on tan B minus C is what? A square equals constant. So these are the equations which together should give us the shape of the geodesic. So what this tells us is that u and v run off to infinity together, so that their ratio is constant. Okay, but what is u? Is t plus r. One of them is t minus r, the other is t plus r. Okay, so sorry, not to infinity, to pi by 2. Tans, these tans run off to infinity together, so that their ratio is fixed. So u and v run off to pi by 2 together. Okay, so that's it basically, because that means that capital R is 0 and t is pi by plus or minus pi by 2. Let's write it. We are asking what happens at infinity. So as u v go to infinity, tan u and tan v both obviously go to infinity. So u and v must each go to plus minus pi by 2. However, if u goes to pi plus pi by 2, then v must also go to plus pi by 2 because of this ratio condition. Both must be positive because a squared is positive, or both are negative, that is, or both go to minus pi by 2. So this point u equals pi by 2, v equals pi by 2 is that point here. This is I plus, and u equals a minus of all of these. Okay, are you convinced now? Yes.
Are you considering unit mass? Are you considering unit mass?
No.
So GBV into UV to 1 is x square.
No.
I actually spent an entire lecture on that, but yeah, as he says, p mu is minus m squared, and u is p divided by m. The whole point of a time-like trajectory or a massive particle is that its four velocity is normalized to 1. If these units find in this metric points. Good. So I think we proved what we wanted. Yeah. So at least in Minkowski space, it's very easy to see that all these, what used to be straight lines because of these complicated coordinate transformations, are curved lines, but they basically all accumulate here in the past and here in the future. Okay? Good. So I've told you everything you need to know about the Penrose diagram of. Yes.
So when I can get the shapes,
What shapes?
I mean those lines.
Is this line? Yeah. So what is this? This is R versus T, right? T as a function of R. Okay. So it should be basically this equation subject to this constraint. So from these two, I should be able. This equation actually traces the path as tau varies. Okay. But this ratio being constant.
Different tau I get.
It's this equation. You see, tan u minus b upon tan v minus c equals a squared. Okay, that is an equation relating u to v, therefore t to r. Once I've got the equation, I've got the shape of the curve. Now if I want to know at where I am on the curve for a given value of tau, then I can trace it using this. So this is the more important equation.
So different values of tau gives me family of this.
No, different values of a give me family. If different values of tau tell me where I am on the fixed one. And B and C will fix some point. So I don't know what it is. You can work that out. It's quite simple. Okay, good. So now having done all this work, let's try to apply it to short symmetry. So are there any questions about Penrose diagram for Minkowski space-time? Yes.
Is there any wavy line from stripe minus to stripe plus will be the massive line?
No. Not a geodesic. I said anyway. I said an accelerated motion of a massive particle can, in principle, take me. So then it's not. Yeah. Then it goes from. It can go from sky minus to sky plus. It can go from any point along this, including from here all the way along this to any point over.
In a normal coordinate, it has to always be inside the light field. What's such path? How does that translate? That constraint translate to?
I think it just says that it can't end on sky minus, for example. If it starts on sky minus, I don't think you can have a trajectory that ends here, because then it would have to reverse it would not be time-like anymore. It would be going from, it would be time-like, it would turn space-like, and it would turn time-like coming back to us.
That gets constrained within that cone, is just that it has to start here and end.
It's actually there in the diagram, right? It's built into the diagram. This is the cone. Okay? So no line is allowed to bend over. Basically means no line can start pointing to the right. So if any line instantaneously is pointing exactly to the right, then it's become space-like. That is not allowed. Actually, more than that. It can be even bend more than 45 degrees. Yeah.
And tangent always has to be less than 1.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Good. Now let's apply it to Penrose diagram. One comment I wanted to make before getting here is that if you think about it, if you look at the Minkowski metric, which I have now erased, there was an overall factor 1 over cos squared u cos squared v in front of it. Okay? But all our discussion didn't make use of that factor. Maybe in some detail it did when I drew the geodesics, but basically we didn't use that factor much. And what this boils down to is the fact that when you do a Penrose transformation to get to those coordinates, you typically get a conformal factor. A factor which multiplies the whole metric is called a conformal factor. It multiplies every component of the metric by the same amount. Now, what is the meaning of conformal? Conformal means angle preserving. Okay? So, it's clear that if I take a metric and scale it even locally at each point in space-time by a different amount, but scale the whole metric, I don't change different components relative to each other, then any angle is preserved. Okay? Shapes can be distorted, but angles are still preserved. Okay? Lengths will be stretched, but angles will still be preserved. Straight triangles may turn into curvy triangles, but the angles locally between any pair of vectors at a point will be preserved. Okay? That's conformal. Now, we see that for the purpose for which we are doing this exercise, a conformal transformation is irrelevant. Because we are asking about the causal structure. The causal structure has to do with angles. It has to do with whether the angle of my line is 45 degrees or less or more. Conformal transformation won't change that. Therefore, this technique teaches us that two spacetimes related by conformal transformation have the same causal structure that we could have always told. And moreover, that given a spacetime, we are free to replace it by a simpler one, which is a totally different spacetime in principle, but with the same causal structure, and then analyze the Penrose diagram of that one. In fact, the Penrose diagram doesn't depend on that conformal factor. In this way, actually, I could have taken the Minkowski space I wrote, written it in this complicated coordinates with this factor and minus b plus some stuff which is quite complicated. I could drop this, in which case this stuff makes for me a very complicated spacetime, and there is no guarantee that it even solves Einstein equations. Okay, this part of course becomes even simpler, but then this part with the angles, after I drop this, there is no more any transformation which takes this thing back to Minkowski space. Okay, so it's a different spacetime, but I can use that spacetime, and its Penrose diagram is that. So these are some useful facts. So in the whole Penrose philosophy, conformal factors are not important. So actually, I should already throw away everything I'm writing for the Schwarzschild metric. Just for completeness, I'll keep writing it. But all these things will have no impact on the story. Now I'm writing it in Kruskal coordinates, but I want to rename the Kruskal coordinates as u prime v prime, because there is an extra term which we won't be discussing much. Okay, so I've renamed the Kruskal coordinates. And of course, associated to these were some T and R, which also I'm renaming as capital T prime and R prime. My motivation for doing this is that now I'll introduce the Penrose coordinates. Those ones I want to call U and V. You'll have to go back through your notes to find out how we arrived at these. There were also some small U and V on the way. Okay. But now, the important thing to notice here is that keep in mind, okay, that this metric R is important, not because it's in the conformal factor, but because it has to be positive, greater than or equal to 0. And this is the equation which determines R in terms of the Kruskal coordinates. And from here we see that R equals to Gm is u prime v prime equals 0, and therefore it's these two lines already at 45 degrees in the Kruskal diagram, and R equals 0 goes to u prime v prime equals 1. Okay? Therefore, if R is greater than or equal to 0, then u prime v prime is less than or equal to 1. So this is a constraint. If you remember, this told us that the Kruskal diagram was not all of the UV space, but it was everything in between this hyperbola, that is all this region. Okay, which in turn we divided into regions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so now when we do the Penrose diagram, we'll have to mark out what's the inside of the hyperboloid after going to the new coordinates. That's the only subtlety, otherwise the Penrose coordinates are totally trivial. It's again just tan inverse. In other words, u is tan inverse u prime and v is tan inverse v prime. Okay, and finally u is t minus r and v is t plus r. And our Penrose diagram again will be in TR space. Okay? Good. So now the first thing to note is that again here u prime and v prime, okay, first of all note that this condition replaces the condition in Minkowski space where r greater than 0 told us that u prime was less than v prime and u was less than v or something. Okay, that's now replaced by this condition. So now first we should let u and v range over whatever their values could be, which means u prime and v prime range from minus to plus infinity. Therefore u and v range from minus to plus pi by 2. Okay, so that's back to this. Now, whereas in Minkowski space we had said that u is less than v, therefore we take only the right half. Now we have to instead implement this more complicated condition that u prime v prime is less than or equal to 1, and this condition is now going to be what? Tan u tan v is less than or equal to 1. Right? Wouldn't be simpler, we've just done a tan transformation on Kruskal coordinates. Okay, so what is the locus tan u tan v is less than or equal to 1? Can you find it for me on this picture? So that is tan t minus r tan t plus r, and then you have to use some trig identities. Well, it's surprisingly simple at the end. There must be 100 ways to do it, but my way is to notice
U minus V less than pi
u minus v,
less than 0.
u minus v, first of all, no, it's u plus v. But how do you get that?
So sin v by cos v less than 1.
Very good.
So sin v less than cos v.
Very good.
Then
Sin
cos
v
cos v
cos v
minus sin v that's
Sin-
cos of u plus v
cos of u.
greater than 0.
Good.
So u plus v greater than pi.
Very good. Nice. I think that's faster than what I was going to do. So I'll follow what you are saying. So sin u sin v less than or equal to cos u cos v. So cos v minus sin u sin v greater than or equal to 0, and this is cos of u plus v greater than or equal to 0. And from the famous diagram we were taught in school, this says that u plus v is between minus pi by 2 and pi by 2, the region where cos is positive. So that's the cos is positive. That's the region. Okay. So what are the end points of that region? Are the points where u plus v. So first of all, note that u plus v was u and v separately have to be between minus pi by 2 to plus pi by 2. That's inside this diamond. On top of it, the sum also has to be between this. So actually, this thing can be u plus v is nothing but twice t, right? So that means t is between minus pi by 4 to plus pi by 4. So I draw these two and I draw these horizontal lines. So I'm supposed to be between these as well as inside the diamond. Okay? So therefore, I finally end up inside this region. Okay, and I should throw away everything else. So I have to throw away this part and this part. Now just to guide the eye, let me draw the null lines through the origin like that. Okay, and now let's realize that the boundaries of these pi, that is u plus v equals pi by 2 or equals minus pi by 2 are the points where the original radius r was equal to 0. That's the singularity. So those are this line and this line. So typically in the books they are denoted like this. It's supposed to be barbed wire to keep you from the singularity. So this is r equals 0 and this is r equals 0 also. Now where have we seen r equals 0? Where have we seen two copies of r equals 0 before? In the Kruskal diagram. One was the future singularity, one was the past singularity. In fact, if you realize, we have done nothing to the Kruskal diagram except the following. We have brought that curved hyperbola thing to a straight line. We have brought the infinity on that side to this stuff. We have brought the infinity on that side to this stuff. And we have brought this hyperbola also back to a straight line. So therefore, without any further ado, this has to be region 1, this has to be region 2, this has to be region 4, this has to be region 3. And if you remember, this is our usual outside, this is the inside the horizon, this is the horizon, r equals 2gm, right? That also we saw, because r equals 2gm is u of v equals 0. We just saw that a few minutes ago. I think I wrote that. Yes. Okay. Then this was the white hole, which was the time reverse of the black hole. And this was some causally disconnected region, which is an identical copy of this. And as always, we don't really have reason to study those two extra things. So the Schwarzschild black hole is just this. But now in Penrose diagram, the outside world is this square, if you like, and the inside of the horizon is this triangle with the singularity on the top. Now you can read off many things. First of all, notice that the singularity is at a fixed time. Okay, and going towards the singularity is going forward in time. Okay, so we see clearly that this is a time-like singularity, this is a space-like singularity. A space-like singularity, namely the singularity is an event in time and not a place in space. Okay, in fact, it's a whole bunch of places in space, but it's all happens at a single time. Secondly, we see now that if we were in this region and we were a ray of light, we would have some distinct choices. We could very well point ourselves that way and terminate on Scri plus, just Scri minus. Or we could start from Scri minus, point ourselves that way, and we would go into the black hole and reach the singularity. Okay? This is completely consistent with what we expect, because if we are outside a black hole and we are going to be radial, remember we are always being radial because we don't want to touch the angles, because we are working with a two-dimensional metric in which the angles don't do anything. We are ignoring the angular terms. So we are only radial. So our two choices are to run away from the black hole or to dive into the black hole radially. Okay. But now suppose we are inside and we are a light ray. We have two choices. One choice takes us straight into the singularity. The other choice takes us straight into the singularity. There are no third choices. So the Penrose diagram has made completely manifest that those are your choices. Okay, all choices lead to the singularity. And if you think about it, what's happened is very nice. It has a complete analog in the structure of geodesics in Schwarzschild coordinates, where we noticed that the ingoing geodesic continues to be ingoing, but the outgoing geodesic changes. The outgoing radial geodesic changes its nature as you cross the horizon and becomes ingoing. That's because of this famous tilting of light cones. Okay? Now here it's not like that, because we straightened the light cones. These coordinates, the light cones are straight, they are not tilted anymore. Instead, there is no outgoing geodesic when we are here, and there is one when we are here. And Scri plus is here, so we see that any hope of reaching Scri plus, if we are a ray of light, can be there only if we are in this region. And as soon as we cross this, Scri plus has gone away from our future. That's really the way to think of it. It's simply no longer in the future of somebody who's in there. Okay? The causal structure has changed, and Scri plus is no longer in the future. So that's sort of the benefit of the Penrose diagram, and it gets more and more beneficial as you go to more and more complicated
Any line
black
that
holes.
starts from J minus or
Scri minus.
Scri minus, whatever,
Yeah.
and hits this line basically. Within R equal to 2G, it will turn back to J, the Scri plus. At only R equal to beyond R equal to 2G, it will hit the singularity.
No, I don't know what you mean by any line.
I mean,
If it's a
any
null
geodesic-
geodesic, it's a straight line, which means it basically
Yeah, but
does
it can go this way as well.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like 45 degrees.
Yeah. If it's starting in, so just assume it's at any point, it has two choices, either it goes that way or it goes that way. Okay. Now now again you can ask about time-like trajectories. So here is I minus, here is I plus, and here is I zero. Time-like trajectories over here would be like this. Okay. But once you're inside, then the time-like trajectories are confined by what the light-like trajectories can do. They are bounded on both sides by light-like trajectories going into the black hole. So the time-like trajectory will also go into the black hole. In fact, it's almost evident from this figure that the time-like one will simply go faster. Okay? The slowest way to reach the singularity is to be a ray of light. It's a little bit strange, but that's how it is. This is the statement that if you struggle in any way, what will happen is that you will be somewhere in between and your path will be to the singularity, to be faster. Okay, good. Now, that's the end of my discussion of this, and Penrose diagrams, if they come back in the course, would come back only when we talk about cosmology, and I'm not yet sure how much I'll be able to do. But just I want to use 5 minutes now to just write down something quickly for you. And I'm proposing this as one of the possible projects people can do. It's a change of subject. And I apologize, but I don't want to devote a whole new lecture to it. Anyway, the notes are going to be there. This is at least one chance to exhibit a new kind of spherically symmetric solution, which is very beautiful because it's so simple to write down. So the idea is solve the Einstein equation in the presence of an energy momentum tensor which comes from electric or magnetic charges. And the result will be an electrically or magnetically charged black hole. The whole black hole will have a net charge. Of course, it could also be an electric or magnetically charged star if, in addition to these charges, we put some matter which smoothens the metric before we reach the horizon. We'll see that there will be a horizon here also. Okay. So, what is the energy momentum tensor due to these? Well, you know that all of electromagnetism is specified by a tensor F mu nu, which is the field strength tensor, and it's the curl of this. And F0, well, TR is called the electric field, and F theta phi is called the magnetic field. If you are looking at radial units. So this is what we call ER, and this is what we call VR, roughly. Now, in terms of these, you can find the energy momentum tensor by a prescription I already gave you for scalar fields, which is that we differentiate the action for electromagnetism, and the action for electromagnetism is integral d for x root z minus g f mu nu f mu nu with a conventional -1 forth in front. But this is raised with the metric, so you need to differentiate it by differentiating the metric, which raises this in two different places as well as this determinant, so you get a bunch of terms. And when you properly normalize, T mu turns out to be the simple expression f mu lambda minus 1 hot mu. So this is completely general, but now what we want to do is specify an electric field which is simply Q upon R square. We can also specify a magnetic field if we believe there are magnetic monopoles, but and it turns out not to complicate things very much. Actually, it's but let me stick with electric field. In my notes, which will be on the web, there is also magnetic field. So we just choose the electric field to be Q, which is the total electric charge of this black hole, over R square. Now we've got enough data because this is the same as FTR, and this can be plugged in here, and I can find the energy momentum tensor of the electric field, all the components. I put it in here, and I make another ansatz for spherically symmetric solution. Perfectly reasonable because the electric field is also spherically symmetric, so there should be a spherically symmetric solution. And I propose that the solution is minus e to the 2 alpha of R dt square plus e to the 2 beta of R square plus R square omega 2 square. And I know one solution, which is alpha equals minus beta and Q is 0. When Q is 0, I am back in the Schwarzschild solution. So this is a generalization of that solution. The nice thing is that I can actually find this solution explicitly in this case, and the solution is that this is minus 1 minus 2 gm upon R plus gq squared upon R squared plus dr squared upon the same factor. If somebody wants to do this as a project, it's not a bad idea. There are many nice things to be said about it. So there, what is beautiful is that Einstein equations have an exact solution even when Q is non-zero, and there is nothing new except the addition of a 1 by r squared term here. Okay, so that's it. Now, one can analyze this solution and one can even draw its Penrose diagram, one can find Kruskal-Krag coordinates, one can ask for its extension. Many things that happen to it are quite different from Schwarzschild, and one of the most obvious is that this is a quadratic. The zeros of this will be in two places. Okay, so there are two horizons and they are at two values of r plus and minus. Earlier we had some r0 which was just 2gm, and now it turns out to be gm plus or minus square root of gm squared minus gq squared. That's it. Now you can see what's happening. If there was no charge, then the plus root would be the familiar horizon of Schwarzschild at 2gm, and the minus root would go to the singularity. Okay, so it looks like the singularity has sort of come out from the origin and become a second horizon. But there's still, if you compute the curvature, you find that both these are points of smooth curvature. So the curvature invariants are smooth, which means they are coordinate singularities. Which means they can be removed by from some opportune choice of Kruskal-like coordinates. Okay. However, r equals 0 is singular. Again, here the curvature blows up. So now there are three places to worry about in this black hole: the outer horizon, the inner horizon, and the origin, which is the singularity. However, what you can immediately guess is that when we cross the outer horizon, t becomes space-like and r becomes time-like, because this thing changes sign. And when we cross the inner horizon, it changes sign again. So actually, once we are inside both horizons, time is again time-like and space is again space-like, and that's a very strange thing. One result is that the singularity is really at a definite point in space, the origin. It's a time-like singularity now. Okay. So actually, I'll stop with, this is a very sketchy description of it, but just to whet your appetite, I'll point out that in the Penrose diagram, the singularity is now here instead of there. Singularity is there. In fact, if I look at it as a function of distance from the origin, r minus r plus, then you can think of it that the light cone is like this, then here it tilts over sideways, and here it straightens out again. Okay, so here time is time and space is space. Here space and time, their role is exchanged, and here their role is exchanged back, and that's the same. It's time-like on Penrose. Okay, this in particular means you can actually leave horizon Nordstrom black hole in a way that you can't leave Schwarzschild black hole. One reason not to discuss this more is that it's a very unphysical example of a black hole. It's not the kind of black hole you expect to see in nature. Okay? In particular, it has what's called a leakage singularity, and the conditions for forming such a thing seem extremely unlikely. Okay? On the contrary, rotating or curved black holes are the kind that we do see in nature, and so we should talk about them, but whether we will or not, I can't say. Next time I'm going to start a process.
So that means you can't put a charge on a black hole.
No, it doesn't mean that. This is a black hole with charge.
But if it's unphysical,
Unphysical means that we don't expect the conditions in nature are right to produce it. See, there's a lot of difference between something that's unphysical in that sense and something that's unphysical in the sense it doesn't satisfy the laws of physics. It perfectly satisfies the laws of physics. It's a valid classical solution to Einstein's equations, and a very, very interesting one. Okay. For example, it has certain stability properties which even the Schwarzschild black hole doesn't have. What is unphysical about it is it in the sense that experimentally it looks like it requires some amount of infinite tuning to actually get matter to collapse and form this. While getting matter to collapse and form a Schwarzschild black hole is not so hard, even that is unphysical because typically while collapsing the matter has an angular momentum. So what you really get, the most physical black hole, is the Kerr black hole. All of them are valid theoretical objects, only one of them seems to be valid experimentally, and that too with very high angular momentum. Okay, so I'll stop.